Okay, everyone. Well, it's bang on 12:30, and welcome back for another instalment of the Australian Government Procurement Series for 2023. Today's instalment being part 4, Key Learnings from the ANAO Reports. I'm delighted today to be joined by my colleague James Evans here, who will be co-presenting on this, and with me has followed a lot of the recent reports and got a lot from them. So it's our pleasure to share some of what we've read and learn from those with you today. Before we get into the presentation, I'll just do an acknowledgement of country. And HWL Ebsworth would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are today. We'd also like to pay our respects to elders past and present. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is part 4, Key Learnings from the ANAO Reports. And as you know, there's obviously been 3 parts before this. Some of you would have been to those, and for those that have been, I hope you enjoyed those, and they've all been recorded. I mention this each time just for new people, and you can obtain those recordings from Katerina, whose email address is below. So we've had those 3. If you've missed them, you can get recordings. If you want to share any of those with colleagues, you can do so, and today's will also be recorded. After this, we've got parts 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And the issues we'll be covering for those parts is on the screen there for you. Today's presentation, as I mentioned, we're going to go through the ANAO in particular and some of the reports that they have produced more recently. The presentation will start with a brief history of the ANAO, which I found interesting when I started to go through this. And we'll be presenting to that, some stats about them, the functions, about the audit office, and so on. We'll then look at where we are now. We'll look at some lessons from the reports that have been put out, and then a couple of slides at the end about how things might change. We're going to have some introductory comments around the audit office itself, some common issues that have come out of the reports that we have looked over. And we want to stress that the reports referred to today are anonymized. We're not referring to them by name necessarily at all. We're talking about a main report and a main joint committee report, but that in itself summarizes a number of other reports. But if you want to go and read all of the reports, I welcome you to do that, or I encourage you to do that, because there's a lot of really good information inside of them. So the history of the ANAO, as I say, I found this pretty interesting, and I thought some of you might as well. It was the 4th Act passed by Australia's first Commonwealth Parliament, and that 4th Act, the 4th ever Act for Australia of its first Commonwealth Parliament, created the Office of the Auditor General. The Auditor General is an independent officer of Parliament, and its responsibilities are listed under the Auditor General Act 1997, which came obviously after that 4th Act and replaced it, but that 4th Act was way back when Australia first passed its first bits of legislation. The Auditor General is supported by the National Audit Office. The appointment itself is a 10-year statutory appointment, and that appointment is made by the Governor General on advice from the Prime Minister and approved by the Joint Committee of the Public Accounts and Audit. The current Auditor General is Grant Hehir. In terms of its functions, the Audit Office functions are listed here: auditing the financial statements of Commonwealth entities, Commonwealth companies and their subsidiaries, auditing annual performance statements of Commonwealth entities, conducting performance audits, assurance reviews, and audits of the performance measures of Commonwealth entities and Commonwealth companies and their subsidiaries, providing other audit services as required by other legislation or allowed under Section 20 of the Act, reporting directly to the Parliament on any matter or to a minister on any important matter. In exercising these functions and powers, the Auditor General is not subject to direction from anybody, in relation to whether an audit is to be conducted at all, the way that a particular audit is to be conducted, or the priority to be given to any particular matter. The purpose of the Audit Office is to support accountability and transparency in the Australian government sector through independent reporting to the Parliament. The Audit Office delivers this through the Auditor-General Act 1997, the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act 2013, and the Public Service Act 1999. And those acts broadly go to finance, procurement, governance, and so on. Powers the Audit Office have, it has extensive powers of access to documents and information to support its functions. So it can look at the files and the records and so on of Commonwealth government entities in order to undertake its functions. These powers are balanced by confidentiality provisions in the Auditor-General Act 1997. In terms of the audit process, there is wide access and information gathering powers granted to the Auditor-General. The Audit Office treats all audit-related information as in confidence. Sensitive information that, in the Auditor-General's opinion, is not in the public interest will not be included in public reports. And this may include information relating to national security, international relations, Cabinet deliberations, Commonwealth and state relations, and unfair prejudice to commercial interests. The Auditor-General is exempt from the application of the Freedom of Information Act. However, as appropriate, the Audit Office provides information on request in the spirit of the FOI Act, particularly in relation to its own operations. Each performance audit has a specific objective approved by the Auditor-General, and the Audit Office provides preliminary audit findings and the final proposed report to key stakeholders. The entity that is the subject of the audit has the opportunity to provide comments. In terms of the number of reports that have been undertaken over the last 5 or so years, we can see a table here that outlines that. And as we can see, the number of reports seems to be slowly reducing, going from a target of 48 with an actual of 58 in 2016-2017, down to a target of 42 with a resulting 40 in 2022-2023, the year just gone. So that's a reduction of 18 audits reports in that time, from 58 to 40 overall. Next, about the Audit Office is just the number of people that staff it, so the number of people, the resources it has to undertake the functions that it undertakes, and the total number of people working in the Audit Office are listed here on the far right-hand side. We can see that there's been a bit of an increase actually over the last year or so, of about 35 people, from 376 to 408 people working at the Audit Office. The breakup of how that total is arrived at, you can see, but doesn't seem to be changing all that much over the last year in particular, so it wasn't really worth going through those numbers in detail. But the total is what it is: 376 in 2022, rising to 408 in 2023. Okay, so where are we now? So what where are we up to? What's the latest from the Audit Office and so on? It's a very interesting report that was released fairly recently, so just last month, August 2023, report 498, titled Commitment Issues. And it's an inquiry into Commonwealth procurement more broadly, an inquiry undertaken by the Parliamentary Joint Committees and the Joint Committee of the Public Accounts and Audit. And this report, as I say, looked at Commonwealth government procurement generally and broadly, looked at some particular reports that have been published over the last few years, some of the more interesting ones, and summarised the findings of those in a very interesting way. But it also came up with some broad themes in relation to government procurement and where it can be improved and where it's not done particularly well, and also where it is done well. And it came up with a list of recommendations. And the first thing that we're going to do this afternoon here is to go through some of those recommendations that it made. And I'll then hand over to James to take us through some of those common themes that the report identified. So in terms of recommendations, the first one was the committee recommends the Department of Finance work to advance public sector procurement capability and professionalisation by prioritising the development and rollout of a procurement professional stream within the APS to facilitate the creation of procurement and contracting specialists, and expanding the current definition of procurement in the CPRs to empower and better reflect modern professionalised procurement practices, including more active management of supply markets and supply chains to maximise value for money. That was the first recommendation, really all about professionalising of the procurement profession. The next one, recommendation 2, the committee recommends that the Department of Finance change the CPRs to reverse the onus such that they apply to corporate Commonwealth entities by default, with any exceptions to be made by the Finance Minister via legislative instrument. So there was criticism of the fact that the CPRs don't apply to all Commonwealth entities automatically, and it is viewed and it was recommended that that be changed. Number 3, the committee recommends the Department of Finance amend paragraph 2.6 of the CPRs, and paragraph 2.6 of the CPRs allows for procurements to be undertaken without the CPRs being complied with, either by way of parts 1 or parts 2 or both. So you can exempt part 2, for example, but keep part 1, or you can exempt both. But 2.6 allows for that in certain very unique circumstances, and provided the relevant accountable and instructions are in place. However, the Department of Finance wants to change that such that there's an emphasis still on the core principles of value for money and conducting procurements in a fair, transparent and accountable manner, despite this exemption. And then Finance should develop and issue guidance on paragraph 2.6 to reflect this amendment. And there's no reason, I mean, at the end of the day, we're spending taxpayer money, and no matter what you're doing with it, it should be able to be justified in a way that it's been done fairly and value for money has been achieved. So that is a sensible recommendation. Recommendation 4, noting that reporting on compliance with the CPRs is currently limited to the inclusion of significant non-compliance in annual reports, the committee recommends the Department of Finance introduce requirements for entities subject to the CPRs to report at least annually and certified by the accountable authority on their compliance with the CPRs. Next, that they publish a report annually commencing 2023-2024, aggregating this information across the sector to help assess the effectiveness of the procurement framework, identifying areas of risk and informing changes to the procurement framework to ensure it remains fit for purpose. And lastly, requiring Commonwealth entities subject to the CPRs or the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act by 31 December to provide Finance with a report on their internal procurement and delegation policies that outlines how value for money will be ensured when procuring from panels. And we'll come back to panels later on. Recommendation 5, the committee recommends Department of Finance amend its guidance to Commonwealth entities to recommend that where an entity engages in significant or complex procurement activity, the entity's audit committee should increase its scrutiny of procurement risks and internal procurement controls commensurate with the scale and risk of the procurement, and the entity's internal audit program should provide assurance over the conduct of those procurements. Number 6, committee recommends the Department of Finance write to the accountable authorities of Commonwealth entities with guidance on how to use probity advisors. And again, we'll come back to probity advisors a bit later when we look at the common themes and some issues. and remind them of their obligation to manage probity in a thorough and consistent manner when conducting procurements. Recommendation 7. The committee recommends the Department of Finance amend its guidance on the use of panels to make it explicit that a separate value for money assessment must still be undertaken when conducting a procurement from a panel, even though value for money has been considered when forming the panel. And panel procurement should involve multiple competing tenders from panel members, with sole sourcing from a panel generally considered inadequate to demonstrate value for money. Recommendation 8. The committee recommends the Department of Finance require panel procurements to facilitate ongoing competition and foster new entries to markets by requiring 1. The panels be refreshed regularly, for example, at least once every 2 years, and at least before a panel is extended. And secondly, an ability for new entrants to seek to be listed on the panel at any time where possible, or at least periodically during the life of the panel. Final recommendation that we'll talk about today, and there are others should you look at the report itself, but the final one that we'll touch on today, recommendation number 9, the committee recommends the Department of Finance amend the reporting requirements on AusTender to ensure that it's clear for every procurement how many suppliers were invited to submit quotes for a procurement, including when procuring from panels and standing offers, as recommended by the ANAO in one of its reports. And secondly, reasons for any amendments or variations to a contract by standardizing the relevant field to produce more structured data. So that's drilling into a bit more detail around the process that was involved in when undertaking a panel procurement, how many people were invited, for example, but also capturing data around variations to contracts, which will be very useful. James, I think it's over to you now.
Thank you, Scott. Just on that report, the Joint Committee report, I think it's quite interesting. I agree with all the recommendations discussed, but very interesting in the way that the recommendations were drawn out of further analysis of, I think it was 5 or perhaps 6 different audits conducted in the last few years by the ANAO, perhaps chosen at random. I'm not sure, the report doesn't say, but an interesting selection of audits, some of which, for obvious reasons, were chosen. Having read several over the last couple of years, 1 or 2 of them were probably some of the worst, some of the most damning. Maybe 1 or 2 of them, others chosen, were actually quite soft, quite gentle, and nice ones. So I think still, despite what was analysed, what reports were analysed, still the recommendations are very apt, and we'll come back to it at the end, but it might give a bit of an indication of where we expect things to end up over the next couple of years. Excuse me. So the first theme out of the Joint Committee report, but just generally from ANAO reports that we've been reading, is that point about the APS procurement capability. It's a consistent issue raised by the Audit Office that there are problems with procurement processes that it can be put down to the management of the procurement from within the entity itself. So issues and weaknesses with procurement planning, the strategy that guides the planned approach to market, issues with the approaches to market, so the processes and the methodology followed, from publishing on AusTender to the next steps that come, releasing addenda, etc. Weaknesses also with tender evaluations, probity management, record keeping, a big one, and contract management. But of course, procurement's very complicated. We all know that, and it takes specialists to do it well. The Joint Committee in that report identified that though procurements can be simple, they may frequently show a high degree of complexity. And when they do, there is a significant risk that APS staff may not be negotiating with suppliers from a position of strength. Often the private sector supplier has probably a better understanding of what government wants than government knows themselves. And also, of course, how the goods and services work. It's a very good point that if government is to really achieve value for money, it has to keep up with their suppliers in negotiations in particular. So government needs to match the market knowledge and technical skills of their providers, hence this point of increasing APS procurement capability. Often in responses to these audits, I've put down here this solution. I realize this, I mean, of course, from working in government, but also through that joint committee report, there was sort of a suggestion that more training might perhaps be the answer, bolstering policies, controls, usually adding layers instead of simplifying and improving. And I really do query if that helps, if it makes it easier, or if it just makes it more difficult. You know, already it's such a constrained talent pool that requiring more training on top of existing training requirements, I think, can complicate things further. So yes, there is certainly a lot to be said about increasing procurement professionality in the APS. The next theme, always a theme, the principal theme, the core principle of the Commonwealth Procurement Framework, made up of the Commonwealth Procurement Rules, resource management guides, any policy notes also released by the Department of Finance, and the Commonwealth Contracting Suite managed by Finance as well. The core principle is value for money. Even if the CPRs don't apply, then still that principle of value for money and achieving value for money in the expenditure of public funds in public procurement still does apply. So the ANAO, which itself provided a submission to that joint committee report that Scott looked at before, they've said that on open versus limited approach to market procurements, that they're seeing evidence that suggests that the decision to exempt procurements from open competition has been based on it being a less costly and easier process for the entity to undertake, rather than a focus on the overall value of the use of taxpayers' funds. So in other words, quite a concerning perception that, you know, it's an easier and cheaper procurement process to limit a tender, to not go straight out to the big wide world, the open market, and that in itself, by running an easier process, that will achieve value for money. And I think that's quite problematic. Of course, having an open process, competitive process, everyone knows that'll always drive greater value for money outcomes, because it makes industry compete. So that's quite an alarming submission from the ANAO, which has of course seen everything happen through all these audits, to that joint committee. Therefore, the recommendations coming out of it are, you know, very impactful. So speaking of findings of the ANAO in various reports, they're continually finding that in these audits, entities are inadequately demonstrating value for money in procurement records and in delegate approvals. So an example of that is that even in open procurements, which are done in long time with no condensed timeframes, just because it might be open, it might be competitive, it doesn't mean that value for money is either automatic, nor is it explained that it was achieved. There's a lot more to it. It needs to be really clearly explained, really. Every procurement itself, every different set of circumstances paints a different picture of value for money, and that needs to be made clear for the decision maker. Frequently as well, the ANAO found that open tenders were being conducted, but that they also limited the restrictions. So, sorry, they put in place conditions for participation that in effect made the procurements limited tenders, so that it looks competitive, but it isn't. Scott, can you probably think of an example there? So of, you know, maybe restricting the location of tenderers. What have you seen?
Yeah, I've seen that indeed. Yeah, I've seen restricting location. We've looked at, you know, previous experience. So you can say, obviously the CPRs are very clear on saying you can't mandate previous experience with the Commonwealth, for example. So if you do that, then that's a clear breach of that. But if you narrow experience down so much, then there's really no one else you could have been doing that experience for but the Commonwealth. So it sort of isn't such a explicit breach, but nonetheless gets there in the end. Now, clearly, you're allowed to differentially evaluate people depending on their different levels of experience and how well that equates to what you're doing. But yeah, putting in conditions of participation that require that can easy will almost definitely be a breach of the CPRs. We've had lots of experience lately regarding mandating that particular tenderers are from Australia, and sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it isn't, and that's really a question for the procurement in hand. But that's something that comes up quite a bit, and that can also be unfairly restrictive, a breach of the fair trade agreements and the CPRs and various other things, and also leave you wide open to a complaint under the Government Procurement Judicial Review Act. So there's all sorts of hairs on that which need to be sort of considered every time.
Thank you. So the last point I'll make about value for money in this context, so in the context of recent audits, was to mention what happened in one recent audit report, where the Auditor General found that the entity didn't assess value for money when evaluating tenders received for the initial stage, known as the design stage. So how it played out in practice really was that yes, there were tenders coming in, they were being evaluated, but as part of that evaluation, there was no necessity upon the panel evaluating to consider value for money. It was sort of presumed partly that, you know, the value for money is assessed in every step, in every process as part of procurement. So it wasn't made explicit, but also that this stage was only a stage to shortlist. It wasn't meant to be a competitive evaluation process. Well, the audit office found that it was, because one tenderer wasn't progressed, so it was used to shortlist, and the records for the decision were incomplete. So it doesn't paint a very good picture. Really, it's just a procurement that's been run really top to tail without consideration of value for money. And it's gotten to a point where you've ultimately got one or two who will progress to a final further stage. Ultimately, one will be awarded the contract. And to get there, there's been no consideration of value for money. So the point there is that it really needs to guide every process the whole way through. Now look a bit more about problematic use of panels. Everyone, finance, the Auditor General, Scott, myself, everyone's quick to remind everyone that the establishment of a panel is in itself one procurement, and that every purchase or every contract under that panel is another separate procurement. And therefore, in both of those instances, the procurement should be conducted according to scale, scope, and risk. There is evidence that suggests that, and this is coming out from a separate ANAO report, might have even been their annual report, or they do, I know they release reports of procurement generally, not just targeted performance audit reports. Mm-hmm. This found that, I've got these figures here, that over the course of 10 years, the value of procurement conducted through standing offers, including panels, increased from 12% to 34%. So quite a significant increase. There's also evidence that suggests there's a minority of suppliers on those panels itself, on very high value panels, and they're awarded the majority of the contract value. There was a submission put to the Joint Committee report that state government panels actually spread value and the number of contracts a lot more evenly. So I think that's going to come up more. There might be a bit more said about that over the next coming years. But also, we've got this relatively recent addition. So since July 2022, new addition to the CPRs. Specifically, I want to talk about Rule 9.14, which is that to maximise competition, officials should, not must, they should, where possible, approach multiple potential suppliers on a standing offer. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I don't know. I think it's probably might be even more problematic if it had said must. But it is definitely a sign of the times where, and even, you know, since this addition to the CPRs, we've seen examples of high profile, in the news, government procurements. I'm going to assume typically off panels, where it's been a certain number of, you know, the big houses winning very large amounts of the work.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose over the next few years, because of this CPR change, it could change for the best. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's a good change. We often see, and I think it's a good idea, and we'll talk about this, I think, a bit later as well, in terms of you don't want to make things too rulesy, but guidelines in relation to use of a panel developed for that particular panel or for an agency of its own making are probably a good idea. I've done those before over the years where you sort of say by default, make sure that you sort of take a round robin approach to approaching panelists so that everyone gets a turn effectively to at least quote. And then depending on the value, it may be appropriate to approach 3, sometimes more than 3, and so on, rather than, and again, depending on the value, it might be okay to approach just 1 where it's a particularly low value, and that's all about proportionality. But this CPR change here certainly suggests that where possible, it ought to approach multiple potential suppliers. I know it only says should, but in terms of possible, that is certainly a pretty high bar, because it will always be possible to do that, provided there's more than one supplier. Although it is noted that when describing panels, it's a bit unusual, but sometimes a panel can be one panelist with multiple contracts underneath that panel. That is an example of a panel, even though it's not very common, but it is an example of a panel, in which case it wouldn't be possible. So it's probably why it's written like that.
The next theme, a few parts to this, probity generally. The first reference to a report here was on the use of a probity advisor. So it was an audit that identified that the entity had used the same probity advisor, the current procurement that was being audited, as they had used previously. So on the previous iteration of the same procurement, so for the same item or same set of services, a couple of years earlier, that same probity advisor had been engaged again. And so, no, they weren't the cheapest when it came to the quote that they gave when engaged under the panel. But the value for money piece provided by the entity was that, well, they were involved last time. They won because of their experience. There was also a few parts that came out of it since then. There was a bit of scope creep. So the cost of the services increased, they nearly doubled over the course of about, a year. But the reason why was the services that probity advisor was engaged to provide, they changed. It wasn't just probity advice. It became all sorts of other parts. It was assisting with the RFT, the request for tender documentation, even drafting the contract as well. And it also, in general, drew into question the probity advisor's independence, because if it's the same person who's drafting the contract as the probity advisor who's making the comment on whether it's suitable from a probity perspective to release that contract, it's a bit questionable. And I think the questionableness might be a sliding scale depending on the risk and scope and size of the procurement. Nonetheless, so a comment was made by the auditor that it's less than ideal.
I've come across that a few times, this blurring of the roles, and been asked about, a sharing of the head, wearing 2 hats. Some procurements and some entities do that more than others, but it was an interesting observation on this one. And I've thought about where the conflict might come in, and clearly there is a chance that if you get an independent probity advisor to advise on a process and its documentation, totally independent of that process, then they'll have a different set of views or conflicts than if that person had as well drafted the documents that they're now being asked to give some independent advice about. So it's an interesting issue, this one.
The next audit, though, quite differently, but still related to probity, was that there was an audit conducted where it reviewed several contracts by that entity relating to a common theme, but all within a relatively short amount of time. And that 39% of those contracts, the officials on them, working on the procurement, various capacity, did not sign conflict of interest declarations. And even on some of them, the probity advisor didn't declare, probably a failing of being probity advisor, which is a shame. But it's quite interesting to see that uncovered. Another audit, and there's a bit of a story to this one. Basically, the gist of it was there was a failure to follow internal probity guidelines. So great guidelines were set up, they weren't followed, and it didn't look very good. So what happened was there was no activity-specific conflict of interest declaration provided by an internal evaluation panel member, suggesting that, in an earlier engagement that they'd sign one. Scott and I will always remind that conflict of interest declarations are not one and done. They're ongoing. Your personal and your professional life develops through the course of your engagement, through the course of the work on the procurement. So they need to be updated constantly. And in particular, if you're to be engaged to evaluate on a panel, to evaluate tenders that come in, you really should be doing an activity-specific conflict of interest declaration, because at that point, you know who the tenderers are, and if you do have a conflict. So there was an actual prior relationship with the tenderer, so an actual conflict of interest in this case, and that tenderer went on to win. The internal procurement team raised concerns up the chain, and the entity engaged external consultants to investigate. The threshold question being, had there been collusion or other activity related to the procurement that would constitute an act of fraud or corruption as defined by the Commonwealth Fraud Control Framework? The consultants went through, investigated, produced a report which said ultimately there was no evidence of fraud or corruption, but there may have been, in other words, there probably was, well, there was a breach of probity guidelines, those being probity guidelines set by the entity itself. But in making those findings, there was no internal investigation into the probity breach. The official involved was not aware that there was actually an external investigation going on, nor made aware of its findings. The affected contract remained on foot, and then subsequently that same contract was varied twice, the value increased, and the delegate that approved that expenditure wasn't even made aware, so approved the variations, wasn't made aware that there was a potential probity breach as part of it previously. Where the ANAO sort of wanted to make the strongest point wasn't that, that looks really bad. It was more that, look, you, the entity, you'd have this really comprehensive fraud and corruption control plan. You'd set these internal probity guidelines, but you unfortunately didn't follow them. Yes, there was these statements made, for instance, in that entity's annual report, that they've set up this fraud incident register. It's constantly maintained, but it wasn't maintained. This is a classic example of something that should have been input into that register and managed, but it wasn't registered and it wasn't managed. Essentially, what the entity did was it had done the work to manage the issue like fraud, but when it came to managing it, they paid a consultant to make a finding that meant that it wouldn't need to be managed. And in the way the Auditor General quite often does, not very strongly and quite subtly suggests that you shouldn't have done that. And another specific audit report relating to probity, and a theme that came out of it, was in relation to a particularly technical and complex procurement. In which case it was found, and again, I've got to paint a bit of a picture, tell a bit of a story, that on this procurement, which required an expert advisory panel to consult the entity in terms of what it actually needed, what it needed to buy, how it could get there, who the players were, and who could supply. in order to do that, to set up that panel, there were, it was a pretty extensive search conducted. A handful of the best in the world, one of which happened to be a former director of a company who tendered for the procurement for various reasons, presumably because that same person is, one of the best in the world and knows everything about it. They were then appointed as the lead negotiator to negotiate with the selected tenderer to work up that contract. They then, again, separately, went on to be a member of another committee, so an independent committee set up to analyze problems like the ones that had just been procured for. And all the while, this company that the person used to be a director of was still providing services to the company. They've now left, but the company itself was still providing services to keep the previous version of that equipment operational. So the ANAO did not make this point, but if we can connect the dots, there's a suggestion that this same person who is leading the negotiations for the new contract, it could possibly be in their interests, because of previous professional connections, to not place the Commonwealth in the best possible position, because the maintenance contract, call it what you like, keeping the previous set of equipment operational is still being held by them. It sounds quite bad. I think everything is manageable. There wasn't much said in this report about the conflict of interest declarations that undoubtedly were made. I have every confidence that they were pretty significant. There were management plans put in place, that they were appropriately approved, but the perception is quite bad. So I'll leave it at that. Scott, did you have anything else to add about audit themes? Oh, sorry, probity themes?
Yeah, and that one's pretty interesting. I've got some experience at the moment of a similar thing where you've just got to sometimes call it out. We've got a person on an evaluation committee on a project that we're advising on, who at the same time is currently engaged to keep a website going. So it's doing that at the same time as evaluating a replacement and improved version of that. Now, you can see there's a bit of an issue there and a conflict where that person might just not evaluate entirely properly or fairly or free of that conflict, and maybe suggest that none of the tenderers were adequate in order to keep that revenue stream coming. So as I say, you've at least got to call that out. That is an obvious conflict and you've got to deal with that. So yeah, probably in that regard on all of these is very interesting. Conflicts of interest more generally, I'm alarmed by the level of non-completion of declarations, to be honest. That is an enormous percentage. At the very least, you need to get those declarations in place and put them on the file, and we're coming on obviously to record keeping in a minute, but it's just critical that happen. And then the people make meaningful disclosures so that they know what a conflict is, because if you don't know what one is, then you can't actually disclose one. So that education piece, and I know that the audit office is big on this, and so is finance, and recommendations everywhere. And some of the submissions received in relation to this report go to, yes, professionalization, but also increasing training along the lines of identification of conflicts in particular. So yeah, it's a big issue, and it's well dealt with in this report.
The next thing, but is record keeping, where really every audit report, every performance audit report has got a bit to say about insufficient or defective records. It's so important because the audit office at the end of the day is concluding that without these sufficient records, the entity really isn't properly demonstrating value for money. There needs to be records of the processes, and those processes need to represent value for money. They need to constantly capture it, and it needs to be recorded. So regardless of officials that sometimes claim that value for money is inherent in everything that they do in every procurement process, I mean, I think ultimately if it's that intrinsic, it should be easy to document because it's part of everything. But it needs to be documented, records need to be kept, and they need to be good records. So some of those sort of key themes as part of record keeping that have come out is that records are not being kept proportionate to the scale, scope, risk of the procurement. Justifications for limited tender over an open approach to market, they're sometimes insufficient, and that's quite important to realise how you've gotten to where you've gotten, whether it be an Appendix A exemption or it could be a Rule 2.6 exemption.
10.3 as well, some with the limited tenders.
Yes, 10.3 as well. Yeah, of course. The third one here is tender evaluation processes and plans, not including consideration of value for money. I've said that a few times. Often high-level meetings. It's funny that sometimes the higher, the more important these meetings are, where these deliberations are ultimately forming the basis of decisions. There's not minutes that are being taken. The more important, the less minutes. And so often, those meetings like that and the results of them are producing documents, which are decision-making documents. And I'll get to that in a second. But the next fifth point here is procurement strategy, planning documents not being updated as scope, size, risks change. These are living documents. Procurements change. These need to be updated. It needs to be updated in such a way that if someone's not familiar with the process, they can pick it up and know how you got where you got and what's next. And particularly as well, if the auditor wants to have a look, these are the documents that say why you're doing what you're doing. There was a couple of instances of documents being edited after decisions were made, because the audit office has typically access to files in the same way that those working within the entity do as well. So accessing it the same way you would, and typically, depending on the software, there's an audit trail built into that as well, and you can see when the edits were made. I think that's a pretty bad look. And then the seventh point here, this is what I was touching on before, final draft versions. So often these documents that form the basis of decisions are often incorporated, usually by reference. Example as attachment A, incorporated into final delegate approvals as a sort of, this is how we got here. This is why we're doing it. This is why we have a requirement for a procurement. Quite often they're not signed. This is a recommendation as well that came out of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, quite a significant recommendation that things need to be finalised, advices need to be finalised, records need to be finalised, they need to be signed. Okay, so looking now at the idea, a bit more on records demonstrating value for money. There was one audit that found an entity was convinced that they'd achieved value for money because the resultant contract had achieved a policy objective. Basically, the ANAO responded to this saying, along the lines of, just because the procurement helps achieve a policy objective doesn't mean it represents value for money. The two shouldn't be conflated. Our suggestion here, in general, as part of value for money, part of record keeping, is to just make it abundantly clear. Set out specific value for money criteria, or make assessments of value for money part of the tender evaluation process. And reference the CPRs and by extension, the PGPA Act. So break down those elements of efficient, effective, economical, and ethical. Because if I was a delegate, I'd want it to be crystal clear that I'm exercising my delegated authority to properly, that's the key word, to properly spend taxpayers' money. And what's proper in this context? In the PGPA Act, it is efficient, effective, economical, and ethical. So I think that's a very good way to use these examples and to produce a proper recorded decision of how value for money was achieved. The next theme, quite different, but on negotiations. There were audits, again, that have pointed to APS capability. Really, procuring entities really need their best, and they need to be at their best when negotiating with industry. Typically, of course, these government contracts are pretty desirable for private sector providers. So, they're going to be bringing their best. There was one audit as well that found it was impossible to track where the final contract landed in terms of the original negotiation positions that the delegate had approved. Some of the positions were poorly defined, or there was no direction as to how to negotiate that point. And I think it can look pretty bad, particularly where things like that are left undirected. So the delegate has approved progression to negotiation, but certain points are left open to the discretion of the negotiator. And I think that's problematic, because if there's no minimum positions or best alternatives to negotiated agreements, and as we know that know of them as BATNAs, if you don't have them, and there's a conflict of interest, then there's going to be a big problem. It can suggest that you've taken the wheel and you've driven yourself based on your personal interests, which is problematic. I've got another point here as well. For complex procurements, be it in value or extent of negotiations, the final contract position should be also reported against the negotiation directions. So how did the entity do? Did you do better or worse than you were sort of expecting you would based on initial delegate direction? And importantly, because of that, what are the risks for the contract manager to be aware of? Moving a bit more onto that, onto contract management. I'll make that point now. It's at the bottom here, the suggestion for contract managers. They should be involved. So in any negotiation, it's probably not going to be perfect. The contract manager is going to need to be aware of what the sticking points were, things that are going to be difficult over the life of the contract. So our suggestion is to get contract managers involved early, get them, if possible, evaluating tenders, in the room for negotiations, have them helping shape their own contracts. To paraphrase the ANAO on one audit, they'd said, the perfect procurement with the perfect contract, actually, no, sorry, this is pure paraphrasing. But in one example, it was that the perfect procurement with the perfect contract still might not achieve value for money if the contract isn't managed properly and if the contract fails to perform in accordance with that contract. So the best way to really fix that is to have good contract management plans in place. And this is pretty important as well. And the ANAO is interested in this because contract managers need to become, I think, a bit more aware about the potential difficulties, potential issues around contract extensions and variations. Often these extensions or variations within initial terms before extending, if they vary the scope, they're actually new procurements and they should be handled accordingly. So I think contract managers ideally should become more aware of that, but there could be a push from the ANAO or from the Joint Committee to see that really sort of new rules mandated possibly around that. I think it's very important. So that's my piece on contract management. Scott, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, contract management is a real sleeper, and it's good that the likes of ANAO, and I know that other bodies around the states, like ICAC, for example, in New South Wales, are waking up to it in terms of the importance of it in the procurement cycle. So much so that when you think about the sort of fundamental principles of probity and so on, you look at transparency, accountability, value for money, confidentiality as those, but being added to that has been basically contract management. So did you get what you thought you were paying for effectively? Because if you didn't, then there was something wrong with the procurements that you've gone through, and value for money in the end wasn't obtained. Even though on paper it looked like it was going to be, it wasn't. And so reporting against that is a really good idea. I think involving them in the tenders is also very important. And then you get that better handover, so that people who are ultimately going to be running the contract understand deeply what it is that's being proposed, how it is that it's being assessed, and what the ultimate offer is that then is going to be rolled out and managed. And then that issue about extensions and variations, that's a real issue as well. So that's in contract, something that ought to be a new procurement, because it's more convenient and it's easier, and sometimes people just want to avoid the rules and avoid procurement processes. It's easier to extend or do improper variations than to go through a procurement process itself. So I think this is a really big issue as well, and it's good that it came out so well in this report. So now we're going to go through things changing and how things might sort of start to change as identified in this report, and just as we've sort of thought about. The first of which is the role of the Department of Finance. So is it a stewardship role or is it a regulatory framework really, and what they look after? Is it both of those? Is it neither of those? Certainly the regulatory framework is there. The question mark about the sort of the stewardship aspect. So the Department of Finance manages the CPRs, it looks after Oz Tender and the Commonwealth Contracting Suite. Plus, they've got the policy stewardship of the Commonwealth Procurement Framework more broadly. Now, that's been very much devolved. So this is what they call devolved oversight. So it's there with that overarching stewardship role. Each entity, though, is responsible for what it does. Finance can help, but it doesn't regulate compliance. And there's no reporting anymore to the Department of Finance on procurement performance. There was in the past, that was done away with, and now entities can, but generally don't. In any event, after this report, you can expect the function of finance to be clarified and redefined, I think. Anything else on that, James, that you'd like to add?
I think it's interesting. The Department of Finance relies on these ANAO reports to gauge performance, because they're just not hearing directly from entities about how procurements are running, the good, the bad, the ugly. So I think it's in that way, it makes these ANAO audits even more important. But yeah, I think it makes the role of the Department of Finance doesn't look as strong as it probably should be. So I think yeah, we can expect it to be clarified or even redefined as well. That's the first thing we might expect to change. The next is around panels.
Yeah. So we saw that come out of this report. There will be changes to panels, I'm sure. More regulation around panel use, some stricter rules around the panels in terms of how they're used, how many people are gone to, how often they're refreshed. But on that, people sometimes there's a lot of work that goes into putting together a panel, and so there's going to be forced refresh after 2 years. You'll probably find less panels being created, which might then lead to a more cumbersome procurement process for a repetitive, reasonably low value item or items, works or services that lend themselves greatly to a panel. So if the benefit of a panel is outweighed by the burden of putting it together, then we might just see that people don't put them together. The other thing is as well is allowing people to come on during the panel's life. This is something that's I'm asked about a lot, which is can I just add people to the panel whenever I like? It's an interesting question, and you sort of say, well, on the one hand, if you're refreshing it every 2 years, there's probably no need to, because every 2 years they're going to anybody who wants to have a turn can. But certainly in the current landscape of up to 10-year panels, I think that's interesting as to whether or not that should be allowed. If it is allowed, and things change, entrants change, entities change, and if you're only allowed to boot people off a panel but not allowed to replace them in the middle of a panel, then it might leave you with not enough. So there's that issue as well. But what process do you go through in order to empanel them? Presumably, and it should be the same process you went through in the first place when it came to the original establishment of the panel. And if somebody then is assessed and comes onto the panel, but for example, they aren't quite as rated as well as somebody who missed out on the original panel because it was decided the panel cutoff would be at 10, for example, and they were 11. And then halfway through, somebody comes along and they want to apply and they get on, but they didn't do as well. Then how does that the party that came 11th or the entity that came 11th, how are they going to feel about that? So there's just a lot of issues I think to think about when doing that. I've talked about panel life.
There's also as well they're sort of recently mandated for new contracts and contracts yet to be finalised in negotiations, at least relating to the Commonwealth Contracting Suite, the introduction of the new notification of significant events clause, which has within it the ability for affected entities, so entities who have had rulings made against them, for example, by court or by professional body, to report that to the Commonwealth entity, to put in place a plan for the management to, ultimately and hopefully say, despite this, we can still continue, the services or the goods being provided, you won't see any difference. But if that fails, that in itself can be cause to terminate the contracts. And I wonder if that might be extended to panels, if that could see you struck off a panel.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, I see. And that would be, there's the flexibility to strike off a panel anytime, but certainly that would certainly add to that, I'm quite sure. So yeah, and I'm sure that will come in actually. Okay, I wanted to finish off by just an interesting excerpt from this report, which I think sums up a lot of what we've been saying, and then we'll just then finish. So this is an extract from paragraph 2.17 actually of this report on page 10, if you'd like to look at it. And it says, an open, transparent and ethically competitive process is necessary. So that's great, good starting point. So it says, an open, transparent, ethically competitive process is necessary, but it's not sufficient to produce a value for money outcome. So it's not all about just the process that you go through and ticking the boxes. And it goes on to say poor preparation, inappropriate specification, speculative tendering, inefficient resourcing, ineffective evaluation, political imperatives, unrealistic budgets, wish list dumping, scope changes, time pressure, poor negotiation, and weak contract management can all ensure that a highly competitive procurement that was executed perfectly on paper still delivers a poor value overall. So I think that really sums it up, which is, yes, obviously the processes are there and they need to be followed, but there's a lot more to it than that. And these audit reports really flushed a lot of that out.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one.